Welcome to Resilience Agenda Radio, the mental fitness podcast. My name is Hadley Fisher. Here at Resilience Agenda, we're bringing you the latest on how to develop, maintain, and improve your mental fitness. With me today, we have Ellen Langer. Dr. Ellen Langer is a professor in the psychology department at Harvard University, where she was the first woman to gain tenure there. She has been described as the mother of mindfulness and has written extensively on our illusions of control, mindful aging, stress, decision-making, and the impact of mindfulness on health in general. She is the founder of the Langer Mindfulness Institute, is a leadership consultant with global organizations, and is the author of several books, including Counterclockwise, The Power of Mindful Learning, and the now classic Mindfulness. Ellen, welcome to Resilience Agenda Radio.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Wonderful. Let's start with your incredible background. With our podcast, we don't often start with the story or the background, but I think in your case, I'll make an exception. What was it like becoming Harvard's first female psychology professor? And did you encounter resistance externally? Did you know all along that you were going to make it, even though it was tough? And did you realize that you were blazing a trail?
That's a lot of question in one question, right? Well, I was more or less oblivious, but I think that when anyone is being considered for tenure at any university, there's a fair amount of stress. And of course, one can never know what's going to happen. As far as being trailblazing or anything of that sort, it never occurred to me. As far as resistance goes, no, the men in the department were all always lovely. And it was interesting because once I got tenure, I asked somebody, so now that there's a woman in the room at these senior faculty meetings, were they any different? And he said no. And I wasn't sure how to respond to that. On the one hand, you don't want there to be a difference based on your gender. On the other hand, you want to feel you make a difference. So I didn't ask the sorts of questions that would allow me to give you the answers you're asking about. Basically, that was the story. It was, it was very exciting. But I think that even if I had been the second woman to be tenured, it would have been exciting. Getting tenure at Harvard was not a small accomplishment, so I was pleased.
So you came in, and was mindfulness something that you were already interested in then, or did that come later?
No. I started studying mindfulness before the word was out there in the world, back in the early 70s. And actually, it's interesting because what I was studying was mindlessness. And then I met somebody, I don't remember who it was. It wasn't a nice person. And he said, you are what you study. So then I said, okay. And I turned it around and started studying mindfulness, and only then became aware of all the Eastern philosophy that existed for quite some time before I started this work. But it should be clear to your listeners that mindfulness, as I study it, comes from a Western scientific perspective. It has nothing to do with meditation. In fact, people don't realize that meditation is not mindfulness. Meditation is a practice you engage in to result in post-meditative mindfulness.
Now, this is excellent. So one of my next questions was going to be, what are the similarities and differences or links between mindfulness and meditation? Can you just outline that for us?
Sure. Okay. Well, so as I said a moment ago, that meditation is a practice. You take yourself out of the world, you sit quietly with your eyes closed, repeat your mantra, and so on. Mindfulness, as we study, and I did early research on meditation, by the way, but mindfulness as we study it is so simple it almost defies belief when you recognize the results of it. You just simply notice. Now, what happens is that most people think they know. Our teachers, all of our schools, our parents sort of lead us to believe that there are absolutes out there. And when you know something, absolutely, you don't pay any attention to it. I mean, if you knew what I was going to say next, why bother listening? But it turns out that everything is always changing. Everything looks different from different perspectives. So in fact, we don't know. My understanding of mindlessness is that we're frequently in error, but rarely in doubt. So if you accepted that right from the start, that you didn't know anything, that you would just naturally be mindful. If I invited you to come visit me, I'm in my house in Provincetown at the moment, You've probably never been here. So you wouldn't have to practice anything. You'd get off the plane, everything would be new, and it would be exciting. All right. Um, because you think you know, you don't engage. All right. So the way to become mindful is just take those things that you think you know, everything, and just look at the ways it's different from the way you thought. The people you are with, your spouse, close friends, coworkers. Walk outside and notice three new things. And each time you notice something new about something you thought you knew, you come to see you didn't know it. And over time, that leads you to be more open to noticing. Now, the problem in this world, as I say it, one of the many problems, is that people think they should know. And so even when they don't know, they then pretend. So I'm here to free everybody of that misconception. No one knows. And if you make a universal attribution for not knowing, I don't know, you don't know, nobody knows, it's okay not to know. And then you don't become stressed by the not knowing, you engage. So mindfulness, as I study, is basically the act of engagement.
That is a fascinating answer. And one of the things about anxiety, for example, is this desire for control, of knowing how the future is going to turn out. And I presume you would say that's a misguided approach, which potentially can be, changed through therapy or through the practice of mindfulness. But
Mindfulness, as I study it, isn't a practice.
oh,
It's just a way of
a
being.
way of being. And so that way of being would mean becoming familiar or comfortable with uncertainty. Would that be a key component?
Yes, yeah. And it's easy to become comfortable with uncertainty when you recognize that outcomes, good, bad, are in your head. They're not in events. So no matter what happens, there's a way of understanding it. So that's an advantage for you. And so once you can appreciate that you can control your experience of virtually anything, you don't need to worry about what's going to happen next. So prediction itself is an illusion. People think they can predict because they're so good at post-dicting, looking back and say, I should have known. But you can't know. You can't know because, if I said to you now, asked you anything that you thought you could predict, what is the weather going to be tomorrow? Tomorrow, you're going to have any new aches and pains? Your hairstyle is wonderful. Are the hairs going to go just where you want them to tomorrow? Who knows? And not knowing is good because then finding out, at least for the moment, is exciting.
And that requires an attitude of curiosity, I take it.
Yeah, but the problem, yes and no. You're curious, but the difference between being mindful and being curious is that when you're curious, you think there's an answer. So, I'm looking at something, is that an R, or an L? And I see a letter in the distance. It wouldn't be an R or an L, but an O or a Q. So I'm curious, and then the expectation is I'll find out, it was a Q. Oh, it was a cute. Okay. The point is that we don't know. Things look different. What I often do when I start lectures to the people who are doubtful, and I just ask them. So I'll ask you, how much is 1 + 1? How much?
2.
No, only sometimes. So if you were going to add one pile of laundry plus one pile of laundry, 1 + 1 is 1. One cloud plus one cloud, 1 + 1 is 1. 1 wad of chewing gum plus one. Okay, so the point is that 1 + 1 does not equal 2 probably as often as it does in the real world rather than the world of abstraction. So once you see, gee, even this very simple thing, the thing I thought, I knew best, depends on context, it's easier in some sense to recognize all the other things we think we know.
That is very interesting.
Let me tell you how all of this came to me. So I was at a horse event. And remember, I'm Yale, Harvard all the way through. I got my PhD at Yale. And there are things that I just knew. Okay, so at this horse event, this man asked me, can I watch his horse for him because he wants to get his horse a hot dog? A hot dog? What is he talking about? Horses don't eat meat. He came back with the hot dog and the horse ate it. And it was at that moment, at least as I tell the story, that it was clear to me that everything I think I know could be wrong. which is good.
So things aren't always as we think they are, and that is a profound insight of many aspects of psychology and an ancient wisdom, that it's not what happens to us that matters, it's how we interpret it, how we
Right.
process it, and what it means. Can you just expand on that for us as to how that's impacted your research in your life?
Well, I started studying that back in the 70s. It was Epictetus, I believe, who first said it's not events that cause stress, but rather the view you take of it. And so, what I tell people is, whatever the event, let's come up with three, four, five ways, other ways of understanding it. And the more often you do this, the clearer it becomes to you, but you just don't know. And that not knowing again is a good thing rather than a bad thing. Um, so we have the event in the first place can be understood in multiple ways. The outcomes of the event can be understood in multiple ways. And so that would account for why you and I both are in a similar situation. I'm a happy camper and you're miserable. Oh, let's make it nicer. I'm miserable and you're the happy camper. Experiencing what seems to be the same thing, but it's not at all. Everything can be understood in multiple ways.
And I find that really interesting when we evaluate success. Australia, Switzerland, where I live, America, quite individualistic countries where we're constantly comparing ourselves to the benchmark of what success is. And I find it really interesting that the general and most common narrative for what success is to use Daniel Kahneman's phrase, the remembering self. When they're listing off achievements from their CV or set point evaluations later in time. But often the everyday experience is completely
Yes.
miserable. And I think it's Sean Acker who uses the example of a friend of his who's a lawyer. And she says, oh, I can't get on with my boss and I hate working 12 hours a day, never got any time for my kids. Oh, but I love my
Yeah.
job. And so, how we can delude ourselves based on this difference between the way we evaluate and remember things and the actual experiencing self. Can you talk us through
Sean
that?
was my student, so I'm glad that you mentioned him. Well, I think that success, like anything else, can be understood in multiple ways. That for me, I don't play basketball, but let's assume I did. And I throw the ball and it circles the rim but doesn't go in. To me, that would be a success because it would take very little for it to then go in, for me to change that shot. Okay. So one can see almost counting. One can think that even if it went in, if it wasn't a Swiss shot, it hit the rim, that it's a failure. So we get to define things. The idea of these comparisons, making social comparisons, even with ourselves, I disagree with Kahneman, is mindless. And that,
Okay.
people, uh, Leon Fessinger said way back when that making social comparisons, there's a drive to do so. And that never made a lot of sense to me. There are people who I agree with, although all the people we come up with now I seem to disagree with. But I say to myself, have I ever asked, I wonder how Peter brushes his teeth? Do I brush my teeth better or not? It's ridiculous. So there are many instances where we don't compare. And the reason it's mindless is because, let's say you and I are doing something and I want to say, am I better than you? I don't know what your motivation was. I don't know if this is your best performance, your worst performance, um, if you're just going through the motions and don't care. So there are many ways that we shouldn't be making these comparisons. Now, how do we look at
But people evaluate us though according to the normative standard of society. And unless you have crafted an identity for yourself that is, outside of that game, people mindlessly may think, well, he's a failure according to my values. So one of the most
but who cares?
insightful things that I ever got told once was, don't judge people by your own values, judge them by judge them by
Exactly.
theirs. But that requires this total shift in
Yeah.
perspective. And for example, if you don't have a million Instagram followers or $5 million in the bank, you're not successful. That's the normative standard, I guess, in society. People have to step outside of that, don't they? How would you evaluate
Yeah.
that?
Well, that even for the person who has five, let's give them $10 million. And how many Instagram followers did you say?
A million.
Okay, so let's give them 5 million. Okay, $10 million, 5 million, 10 million Instagram followers. He wakes up in the morning, and what's going to make him happy, or her happy, or sad is going to be how engaged they are as they're waking up, what their plans are for the day, how they go through the day. Very rarely do people walk around saying, "Okay, I have 10 million Instagram followers. I'm happy because I have $10 million in the bank." Those are almost accomplishments from the past, rather than what you're doing at the moment.
So it's our relationship to everything that matters. And your argument would be that you get to decide your relationship to everything, and you do that by noticing.
Yeah, exactly.
What have you made of the popular mindfulness movement over the last 30 years? The breath work, the gurus, the meditation, the woo woo. At our organization, we often use the term focused attention, to try and get away from some of these
Yeah,
negative connotations. Because everyone's heard of mindfulness, but not everyone can define what it is. Not everyone can define why it's relevant to them. And especially for busy people often sensibly say, well, I can't find a weekend to go to an ashram, or I can't find half an hour a day to be on my cushion. Talk
yeah.
us through your mindfulness, which just requires doing what we're already doing, but slightly differently.
Doing it differently. Yeah. No matter what you're doing, having an interview, reading a book, eating lunch, or playing a sport, you're doing it either mindfully or mindlessly. And 45 years of research that we've done suggests the difference is enormous. So the findings we have are really unbelievable. We make people more mindful, they live longer, they're happier, they're healthier, they're charismatic, they're more authentic, their memory is better, everything seems to improve. And if you have a choice where you're going to do something and be there, or do it mechanically like a robot, it seems to me a no-brainer. So the problem is not so much persuading people that it's good for them to be mindful. It's making them aware of how mindless they are. That when you're mindless, you're not there. So you're not there to know you're not there. But again, 45 years of research suggests most of us are not there most of the time.
So let's talk through some of these key barriers to being mindful, or to use your phrase, these key enablers of mindlessness. Is it not planning well enough? Is it
No,
smartphones? Is it our innate biology that we just have to
no.
overcome? What is it?
No, it's none of those. It's that we've been taught right from the get-go to see things and search for absolutes, as the one and one is two. And you're told this is a boy, this is a girl, this is a family. Whatever we're told, we should be told that one way of seeing things is, or probably often could be, rather than is. It's a very different world. That So you start off, and so let's just take, as I said before, you're told as a little kid that, okay, Johnny, the family is mommy, daddy, and you. And then, so that's what you believe the family is. And then mommy and daddy get divorced. It's very hard to convince little Johnny that they're still a family. Everything that we're taught to hold things still, to gain some control over our world. And that very thing is what keeps us from having control.
Are people becoming more susceptible to this all or nothing thinking, this non probabilistic thinking? Or is it something that is just innate? Or is it cultural?
No, I don't. No, I don't think there's anything innate about it, and I don't think that they're becoming more mindless, is what you're asking. No, I think that sadly is pretty steady state. That all derives from the way we're taught. We're taught to look for absolutes, so we look for absolutes, and in doing so, we don't see anything that deviates from that. We do this silly little thing. I show people an index card, and on the index card it says, Mary had a little lamb. I ask them to read it, and they say, Mary had a little lamb. They don't have a card in front of them. I say, how many words were there? Mary had a little lamb, 5 words. I'll pay you for accuracy. What was there? Mary had. They just don't see. You don't see what you don't expect. And the stronger our expectations are, the more blind we become. So, so most of us are just not experiencing all the world has to offer for our senses, for our daily lives.
So most of us tend to interpret the world, or we have this running commentary in our heads cognitively. Thoughts. We have thoughts about the world, judgments about the world, where, saying, I like this, I don't like this, I want this, I don't want that. But you might argue that thinking, to use the term thinking that way, is only one way of seeing the world. How else can we see the world with our senses? Talk us through how in your day there are these special moments. I'm sure you've thought about the key moments where being mindful is easier than others. What are some of these prompting or trigger moments for mindfulness in the day?
Well, whenever you're approaching something that for you is new, then you naturally pay attention. Just as when you think it's same old, you don't pay attention. And the sad thing is that, when you see it as too new, then you get stressed. And you see it as same old, then you get bored. And it is neither same or new. It depends on how you approach it. So let me give you an example. I've been teaching one of these courses that I teach at Harvard for 30 years. And so I could say to myself, oh, I can't go through it yet one more time. I go there, they're scared to death, and then they come to appreciate it, and, same old, bored. Or I could say to myself, gee, these kids that are coming in this September are going to be brand new. They all have lived through a pandemic. It's never happened before. I don't know if they're going to appreciate anything I'm going to say, if they'll enjoy it, if they'll understand, if the course will be any good. And I could get myself stressed for the very same event.
Yeah.
So when you're stressed, you need to see the ways it's similar to things you've already experienced. When it seems same old, you need to recognize the ways it's new. So we have, again, the general feeling that everything we experience is in the world hitting us in some way, rather than we're the active interpreters of what's out there.
Yeah, I like that.
And another way of looking at that people don't recognize is that emotions are choices. So I might say, you made me angry. Well, you're not making me anything. If I understand the situation in a different way, I'm not going to be angry.
Let's talk about the power of language. You made me, or I became. Talk us about the way we use language and the breadth of our emotional vocabulary can impact how we experience the world. So, for example, a person might use the word "I'm upset" about 10 different emotions. I'm upset. I'm sad. And so their vocabulary might be upset, sad, happy, or amazing. But are they
Mm-hmm.
frustrated? Are they disappointed? Talk us through these degrees of nuance within emotions.
I think you've said it well enough that clearly, if we have 10 ways available us to describe a feeling, say a negative feeling, and we know of 10 understandings of similar feelings, then we get to make the choice to see, whether this is devastating or mildly aggravating, and so on. I have some one-liners that I put in the book to remind people.
Tell us about some of these one-liners, Ellen.
This one, I think, is very useful. You need to ask yourself, is it a tragedy or an inconvenience? Because as you're saying that something goes wrong and people don't have a vast vocabulary, and so, oh my God, rather than take a breath, the dog ate the homework. Okay, so the teacher will understand. Even if the teacher doesn't understand, it's not going to affect your life. You missed the bus, you got into a little car accident. These are not major things in the course of one's life. And so if you just breathe and then ask yourself, is it a tragedy or an inconvenience? And there are, as you're suggesting, 10 other descriptions we could use. You immediately come back to yourself and feel more control over your life.
We use a concept called the catastrophe scale, and we draw a picture of 1 to 10. This is not going to affect me. This is the end of the world. So number 10 is the end of the world. Number 9 is the end of my world. And just getting people even to think about the terms of, okay, this might lead to your death, but the world will go on. That may be upsetting for some people, but it changes the reality of something happening to me and nuclear war.
No, I think that's great. But I think in addition to that, one has to ask themselves, how is this actually an advantage? And when you do that, if you know that everything that happens is in equal measures, depending on how you understand the situation, good and bad, uh, then you don't have to worry about what happens next because, so we're having a nice talk now. I'm enjoying it. But if my internet goes out, so be it. What's going to, it's not going to matter. It'll give me more time to go to my next activity.
Yeah.
And so when you realize again that you're in charge of how to understand it, and when you really think of it that way, and you say, well, why would I be so foolish? If I can make this a pleasant experience, why would I be so foolish to make it unpleasant for myself?
And the answer is that things should be a certain way. We use this should. I think, I can't remember the lady's name who said the tyranny of, Karen Horney, I think it was, the tyranny of shoulds.
Yeah, and Albert
And Albert
Ellis.
Ellis said the same thing. And this is something that has totally changed my life, and which inspires the term mental fitness. And the thing about a lot of these skills is that they're more useful to both apply and learn when you're not in the middle of something particularly awful. They are easier to apply when
Sure.
things are okay. And that's where I think the real traction with this term mental fitness comes from, because people get it. You have a heart attack, the doctor says you really need to go and do some more walking, but you're probably not going to start with a marathon. Very often we try and solve our life problems or deal with mental health issues, for example, in a necessary way from a point of lacking resources. Yeah, you try and solve problems from a place of lack of resources. And so can you give me any ideas as to how we can inspire people to care more about this stuff before they need it? Because the irony of all this is the person whose life is currently fine, they may not know, they may not be mindful enough to know that they're not fine. They might be happy in this evaluation sense of the word, but not really truly happy. And so how do you get through to a person who's not even paying attention?
Yeah. Well, and that's interesting because, okay, so person is going through their life and then something happens. That's a time when actually they're no longer going to be mindless. They're going to start looking at things, and all they need to know is that they're in charge of what they look at. I say to a lot of people, so I do a lot of work with health. You have somebody who is miserable in the way you're describing. They find out they have 6 months to live. Of course, the medical world can't possibly know that, but they nevertheless lead people to believe this. People accept it. Okay, but so you're one of those people, you think you have 6 months to live and you're miserable. I would just say to you, is this the way you want to spend your last 6 months? So when people realize that they need to take responsibility for how they're feeling, and that when something terrible happens, like you get to the point. So for someone like me, and I'm older than most of the people you're talking about, but I don't experience it as negative in the first place. So I don't have to do any mental gymnastics to turn it into something positive. And so even if, as people do this more and more, this becomes just a way of being. And so when that bigger thing happens, again, they're not transforming it. They just immediately see the upside of it.
Hmm.
But if you're not at that point and it seems, and oh my God, then you take a breath. And if you're in charge, how else might you see it? What are the advantages? Now, some things are harder to do this with than others. Let me tell you a personal story. So many, many years ago, I had a major fire that destroyed 80% of what I owned in my house. And this was around Christmas, and I went to live in a hotel. I had, no choice. And it was around Christmas, very scary. I left the hotel room. I came back. This was Christmas Eve. I came back. The room was full of gifts, not from the owner or the manager of the hotel, from the so-called little people, the people who parked my car, the chambermaids, the waitresses. It was phenomenal. And at this point, I can tell you, I can't remember anything that I lost in the fire, except the notes for a class I was teaching. But always, especially at Christmas, I remember how kind people can be if they just allow themselves to put their stress aside.
That makes me think of one of the great benefits of mindfulness, both as the way you describe it, but also as the way different interpretations of mindfulness um, have it. And that is that if you are noticing what's going on around you, whilst a lot of the Buddhist believers, for example, believe that everything is ephemeral, you can also hang on to great memories. You can hang on to these reference points that you can take with you into the future and that become sources of strength for you. Whereas if you're mindless and you're going through life not noticing what's going on and something bad happens to you, and you look back and you think, when was the last one of these? As Ray Dalio often says about the economy, when was the last one of these? Or do I have anything that's not totally awful? If you weren't paying attention, you've got very little to work with other than what you've got in front of you right now.
Yeah.
Talk us through that.
Well, you just did. You keep asking me to talk through things that you say beautifully.
Oh, thank you. I've been thinking about this stuff for a long time. I'm just curious to hear what you have to say about it. Let's change tack then. You're a big believer in a concept that I subscribe to, which is work-life integration, rather than work-life balance. The seesaw is never actually in the middle. Talk us through what work-life integration means to you. And for those people who might be listening to this answer a bit skeptically, saying, oh, I could never do that in my situation, or my boss would never let me do that. What are the necessary conditions that are required for work-life integration? And what is within the individual's circle of
Yeah.
control?
Well, I introduced the concept of work life integration a few years ago in response to all of these business gurus talking about work life balance. And work life balance is, of course, better than work life imbalance, but there's a much better way. And everything we've said so far speaks to how to lead this integrated life. I can't understand why people would accept a life where 40 hours a week minimum, that they're stressed and unhappy and, oh, God, I need a vacation from this. That when you recognize that work is just, they're just people. And there are people who have the same needs that we have. And when you come to the work situation with the intention of being the same as you are at home, you want to play seriously and you want to work playfully, recognizing that, as I said a moment before, that when something happens, it's probably an inconvenience rather than a tragedy. So that, and people make a mistake in expecting perfection. Not so much because, as you're thinking, that you can't achieve it, but because if you achieved it, you would just be mindless. So the example I too often use is golf. So you're playing golf, you're frustrated and so on. Now, if you were able to get a hole in one every time you swung that club, there'd be no game. So people need to recognize that these problems along the way, these difficulties, are what make it interesting. Unless we go overboard and think, oh my gosh, a week late with the project and my life is going to end.
It sounds like what you're talking about there is to apply, it's not the destination, it's the journey that counts. So to be more internally focused on process, presumably whether that's our health or our careers
Yeah,
or whatever it might be, or learning, there's almost never a point at which you've made it. And the way I've tried to set my life values is to actually set them in such a way
yeah.
that I
No,
know
that's
I'll never
good.
get there.
Yeah,
Am I kind enough? Well, I don't know. If I'm not kind to the people that I come across up until the day I die,
right.
then I haven't quite achieved my goal. I want to learn a lot. Well, if I'm not curious or I don't read that book, then I haven't learned everything. What do you think about this idea of process thinking rather than outcome thinking?
Well, that's the difference between mindlessness and mindfulness. Now, well, not everybody, but many people certainly have heard it's the journey that matters. What they need to do to really understand that is to think of past successes and how little they buy us at the moment. So another example I'm fond of using is you're a little kid and you're in the elevator and you can't quite reach the button. And so it's very exciting. You're going to be tall enough. And then, ta-da, you're tall enough and you can reach the button. And then after that, How often have you been in an elevator where you've gotten excited because you can press the button? So you think of things that you couldn't do and then you were able to do, and they no longer feed you the way you need to be fed. We need to be fed.
Yeah,
So that you don't want, you can either do things perfectly mindlessly or imperfectly mindfully.
I like that.
So,
Yeah. You're a painter, Ellen,
yeah,
and what my wife likes to draw. And I wouldn't say that painting or drawing are particularly my strengths. But what I like about these disciplines is that when you're doing life drawing or real life painting, even photography, which is increasingly a strength of mine, I suppose I could put that in the same category. What you're really doing is learning to see. So you could argue that
correct.
it's a form of mindfulness or a
Oh, for
form of
sure,
noticing.
for sure.
Talk us through how these flow based experience and Mikhail C, I'm going to say C because I'm not going to pronounce it correctly.
That's a holiday. Just call him. He had always been called Mickey.
Mickey's flow work. How does creativity and flow work and these things outside of work that are often considered hobbies or superfluous are actually great training grounds for both life and mindfulness?
Yeah, well, there are so many ways for me to answer that. Let me start by saying I could have called mindfulness mundane creativity, because that's all it
Okay.
is. As you're noticing, you're creating new things for yourself. I didn't, because people have a mindless notion about creativity, which depends on the product. So, for instance, if after we speak, you're so motivated, you derive the theory of relativity for yourself, the world is not going to applaud you because Einstein already did it. But for you, it's still quite an accomplishment if you could do it. Now, as far as people that often ask me, what is the relationship between mindfulness and flow? And this is kind of interesting that Mickey started his work on flow around the same time I did. He is a personality psychologist. I'm a social psychologist. So we'd be speaking to somewhat different audiences. He'd often get the question, so how is flow different from mindfulness? I'd get the question. And it turns out that they're very similar. The major difference is that flow is a special event, according to him, where mindfulness is available to all of us virtually all of the time. All right. They're very similar concepts. It's a matter of total engagement. Well, how do you become totally engaged in something? You start off by not thinking you know it. You start off by not worrying about how well you're going to do it. Which is what often happens with art. And you just do it, and you do it, and you notice new things, and it becomes exciting. But there's no question that art as a way to get into this being mindful. You think, if you ask somebody what is the color of grass and they say green, I say, well, let's go outside and now look at any patch of grass and watch it as the sun changes in the sky. That it's many, many shades of green, so that everything becomes much more alive. And at some point, you stop thinking that you know just what it's going to look like. But I think also that it's easier to learn to be mindful in the world of art, because people think that people are less evaluative. That we have less of a sense of what excellence is. Well, I'm not sure that's the case. I find people would look at my work, and some people would say, I love it. Some people would say I hate it. But the ones who've got it all wrong are saying it's awful or it's great. It's not anything. It depends on how we approach it.
Yeah, I like it. I may not like it.
Yeah.
Let's go back a step to what we're talking about. Now, just for our listeners who may not actually be familiar with the concept, talk us through this concept of flow and what it actually is, and why Mickey deemed it such a valuable component of happiness.
Well, no, I'd rather talk, and you ask him about flow. I'd rather talk about mindfulness, but that essentially you're so engaged in what you're doing that you're oblivious to concepts like evaluation, fearing failure, and so on. So it's just a matter of engagement, and it doesn't have to be a special state. That you're listening to a program that's very exciting to you. Well, there you are. You're totally engaged. You don't want anybody to interrupt you. You're reading a book. Wow, I can't wait to see what's happening next. Or you're painting a painting, And, time for dinner. No, no, no. I just have to finish whatever piece you're working on. It's just a matter of allowing yourself to be there for whatever you're doing. And from my perspective, with respect to anything, if you're going to do it, you should be there, whether it's brushing your teeth or anything else. And that it's easier to be there when you realize that the there can be done playfully, which again obviates the necessity for distinguishing between work and play.
I like that. So, doing the dishes, for example, is something that I used to totally hate.
Mm-hmm.
And I've turned it into something that I do mindfully. I feel the water on my hands. I, enjoy getting every little speck of grease off. And I've turned it into a moment where, I lead a pretty full-on, fast-paced life, like a lot of people. And that's an opportunity to just stop and smell the roses and be. And
Yeah.
that is a really interesting one. And I remember, and I've only learnt this in the last decade, but I remember back when I was 15 or 16 and I used to stack shelves at the supermarket. I hated the job. I couldn't stand it. I was bored. And would you say that boredom is just a lack of creativity in paying attention?
Yeah, boredom is mindless, just as stress is mindless. That boredom is responding to a situation as if it is no different from the last 30 times you did it. And it's always different if you choose to notice the differences.
What advice do you give to parents if they like the concept of mindfulness and want to try and raise more mindful kids? Is there anything they can do without coming
Oh,
across
for
as
sure.
overbearing?
Most important thing is to, well, other than being loving and supportive, is for them to teach their children to respect, exploit the power of, enjoy uncertainty. That, so you teach the world as could be. It would seem that from one perspective. Just contrast it with what goes on in school where you might be taught in the United States. I'm sure in some textbooks, here are the 3 reasons for the Civil War. Well, who says so? From whose perspective, at what time, and so on, rather than learn, here are 3 perspectives that one could take. And then you immediately say, oh, I wonder what other perspectives might be.
Yeah. You wrote a book called Mindful Learning. Talk us through what
Yes.
mindful learning is all about.
Well, it's really what I was just laying out for you. That mindful learning is conditional learning.
And so I suppose that teaching for the test and having to rote learn things is the antithesis of that.
I think so, but it's so hard, in this culture where grades are so important. Remember, I teach Harvard students, and I try to tell them a different way of studying for the exams, and they're too afraid to try it. But if you make something meaningful, you don't need to memorize it.
I like that. I was about to ask you, is there a way that you can both succeed according to the criteria that we need to, but also intrinsically enjoy the process as well? Like, what do you have to do for both?
For sure. I mean, it's like you're washing the dishes. That a lot of people, as you suggested, don't enjoy washing dishes. However, many of those same people enjoy washing their friends' dishes. So if you're invited for dinner, you feel heroic. No, 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 let me do the dishes. And that's fine. So all they need to do is recognize how they're doing the same thing under different circumstances and the different feelings that gives rise to realize you can do that washing your own dishes, that anything can be done where it's made to be fun and exciting. Virtually anything. Let me tell you a story that seems to me to illustrate this well. I was visiting a friend of mine who was living in Museum Towers in Manhattan. So this is very, very wealthy people live there. So I go in, which is relevant to the story. I go in and there's an elevator. I'm like, take the elevator. Now there's an elevator operator. Well, really, we haven't need elevator operators for forever, right? You press the button. You don't. Okay. But so this is where he turns the wheel, and you see the different numbers. And I'm thinking, oh, this poor guy. I mean, all day long, all he's doing is turning this wheel to. But that's not what happened. So I watched him. He wants to know where I want to go, and I give him the name of the person. He goes, oh, it's the 33rd floor. Well, that was, interesting because there are lots of people who live there. Okay. Then I see he looks at the numbers, turns around, and turns the wheel, guessing Can he get to just where that floor is without looking? Made it a game. And, he knows to go a little less than rather than more. So, because it probably wouldn't be good to go to the 50th floor and then come down to the 33rd. So, but he essentially made it a game. So what seemed to me boring was not boring at all. And let me give you another example that was kind of interesting. This was, again, many, many years ago, before you were afraid to pick up hitchhikers. And I'm in Italy and driving, and I see these two young people wearing T-shirts that say New York. So they just came back from New York City. They couldn't be from New York because no one in New York would wear such a thing. So we give them a ride. And I asked them, were you just recently in Manhattan? They say, yes. I said, how did you like it? I said, we were bored. There was nothing to do. Now, there are few places on earth that are more exciting, but you cannot engage and then be bored. Or you can have a field of wheat, where for many New Yorkers, they'd be bored looking at it. Or you could be a farmer where you notice tiny differences, among the sheaths of wheat, and make it exciting. Doing dishes, you can make it a game. You can challenge yourself. How quickly can you do it? So can you do it with one hand, whatever it is you do? Or you can see it again, same old, same old. Everything we experience is a function of our choice.
So, what advice would you give to someone who just hates their job, and before they make a drastic change,
Yeah.
might want to actually just think about things a bit differently? What would you say to someone who just hates their job and who could do with a fresh perspective on it before they make a big and
Yeah,
potentially...
the first thing would probably be to ask them why they hate their job. And they hate their job because they're not appreciated, or they hate their job because the supervisor is a bully, or whatever. And so then it would just be a discussion about people, that anybody who has it together is kind. And so when people are bullies, it's because they don't have it together and they need to make somebody feel inferior. So for me, if you were picking on me, knowing this, I'd feel sorry for you. Rather than one down, I'd be in some sense one up. And then I'd go easy on you and forgive you for being so vulnerable.
Wow.
That, when it comes down to the task that you're given, and you want to leave the job because you can't do it, um, there are several possibilities. One is to learn how to do it. Another is perhaps it's beyond learning, that a person who's not trained shouldn't have been asked to do it. And there's nothing wrong with saying that. People constantly, in conversations where they say, can I ask you a stupid question? What makes a question stupid? All of us didn't know what we now know at one time. And so we all have to learn it. And I think that, but most of the problems at work are interpersonal. And so they're no different from interpersonal problems outside of work.
What do you make of the happiness industry?
Yeah. It's better than people feeling that they're resigned to being unhappy.
But what if they are constantly comparing their present state, which necessarily involves disappointment and suffering, to this McDonald's version of life that isn't realistic? Could it actually be doing more harm?
Oh, for sure. That there's actually data that people young people especially on Facebook, because most people on Facebook put on their best face. And so when you're reading it, you're comparing your not so best face with somebody else's best face and feel inferior. So I tell my students, get off Facebook or have the guts to change the norms and tell it as it really is. And I think that when you're seeing somebody excel, you have to realize that they weren't always excelling, that there's no reason to believe you yourself can't excel, that everything doesn't happen instantly. And there are things that you're already doing that are special that you're not giving yourself credit for.
Absolutely love that. And it just reminds me of everyone else's overnight success is very often the product of 20 years of feeling like you're feeling right now.
Exactly.
After 45 years of research, writing, and teaching, what's next for Ellen Langer?
Well, I have a new book that I'm sending off to Random House probably tomorrow, and have
Okay.
another one that I'm about to begin. I have lots of very fun projects that may or may not to come to fruition, but what I appreciate about myself is that I live in the world of possibility. So I'm excited about these things that may happen. And when they don't happen, then I'm excited about the next thing. I don't really know. I know that I write about decision making, and decision making is very hard for most people because they think there's a right decision to be made. And so, again, one of my one liners is instead of worrying about making the right decision, make the decision right. So I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but I can't imagine that it won't be fun.
Can you give us an insight as to what this book is about?
Yeah, I knew you would
Give a
ask
little
me
bit of a
that,
sneak
and as
preview.
soon as I said it, I said, "Oh, it's too early for me to talk about it." But the title, well, I'm not even permitted to share that much. It's more about health, but health that's real health, full health that's available to all of us, and the way to achieve it. It's sort of a book that's very similar to mindfulness, but with a whole different set of propositions and research. It's great.
We look forward to following it closely and letting our listeners know about it when it's out.
That'd be wonderful.
Speaking of books, is there a book that has had more influence on your life and how it's conducted than any other that you'd like to share with our audience and why?
No, it's not that the book has an influence on my life. It's the influences on my life that lead to the book.
Okay. Can you tell us the example?
So, I mean, mindfulness started this whole industry in some sense. So that's very exciting. You know, that at this point now, as you said before, you can't open a magazine or listen to somebody on the radio or television talk without using the word mindful. But again, many of them are not using it in the way I would like. So for me, mindfulness is not a brand, it's a way of life. I was giving a talk, this is apropos of nothing, but I was giving a talk a few years ago and my work on mindfulness. And then I went around the corner to get something to eat. And I went into a restaurant that was called the Mindful Burger. The word is all over. But then also I got a call from a journalist at one point who said, Professor Langer, is mindfulness just a fad? And despite the fact that people are using the words and some are getting tired of the use of the word, I said to him, well, let's say that every day you make toast for yourself and you burn the toast. And someone comes along and says, all you have to do is turn the dial over here down just a little. And so now the toast is good. Are you going to go back to burning the toast? Now, when people realize that mindfulness, as I study it, couldn't be simpler, that you just have to know you don't know, you notice new things, that's the essence of engagement, it feels good, and the evidence is clear that it's literally and figuratively enlivening. So when you see that when you're in this state of mind, everything is better for you, you light up as a person, so people find you more appealing, it leaves its imprint on the things that we do. It's hard to imagine why anyone would choose to be otherwise. So as I said before, lots of people are living these mindless existence, not by choice. They just don't realize that they're mindless. Because again, when you're not there, you don't know you're not there. So that's the reason that I think that what we need to do is wake up and just presume we don't know and just start noticing and do whatever it is you're doing a little differently than you did it the day before.
What a wonderful way to close. How can our listeners learn more about you and your work and keep track of the upcoming books that you're writing?
Yeah, well, they can go to my website, ellenlanger.com. Is that a clever name? And read the books. These books, in Mindfulness, the 25-year anniversary edition of Mindfulness, Counterclockwise on Becoming an Artist, let me see, Power of Mindful Learning. They're all written for a general audience. They're easy to read. And I think that the takeaway from each of them will lead to being a little more open to the world around us.
Wonderful. I just want to ask you one more question. It's just come to me just as you said that. Your little microcosm of samples, I suppose you'd say, are some of America's or some of the world's brightest minds. Do you find it an additional challenge to share the mindfulness message with these people who have got plenty of good things to think about and presumably, or maybe they aren't thinking in the way that you would encourage them to? Or would you say that teaching at Harvard, people are more open to the message because of their backgrounds, or are they more difficult to get through to because of who they are?
Yeah. Well, the students are certainly easier to talk to.
Okay.
They come in wide-eyed and expecting that you know everything, they know nothing, which is of course ridiculous. And so they eat it all up. As far as colleagues go, I don't think it's any different from any other occupation. There are some people who are stubborn and think they know everything and don't want to learn anything new. There are those who are open to new information. I believe that the faculty at Harvard will probably be more open to all of this.
Wonderful.
They in some sense, the more you know, the more you come to see you don't know. And so once you know you don't know, then you seek information.
That makes life very interesting. Thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to having you on again. Thanks for listening to Resilience Agenda Radio, the mental fitness podcast with me, Hadley Fisher. If you enjoyed today's episode, we invite you to subscribe on your favourite podcasting platform so you'll never miss an update. If you'd like to know more about Resilience Agenda or mental fitness, jump on over to www.resilienceagenda.com. There, you can learn more about our other guests and pick up the show notes from today's episode. You'll learn more about our story, the Mental Fitness Toolkit, and discover our best-selling mental fitness diaries, jam-packed with dozens of strategies and ideas for how you can improve your mental fitness each and every day of the year. Over 25,000 people every year use our diaries to plan time for their own mental fitness or as unique and meaningful gifts for family, friends, and colleagues. That's it for today. We look forward to you joining us next time.